Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson we're going to write our first service worker. We're going to do an introduction to the Chrome DevTools for progressive web applications, and we are going to start covering the Service Worker Lifecycle. Let's keep in mind the key overall philosophy of the Service Worker Lifecycle. It's about ensuring consistency by default and making sure that the user always sees one version of the application, even if it has multiple tabs of the application opened. Let's then start writing our first service worker. Let's call it sw.js. We are going to put it here right next to the registration script, here in the source folder. Let's create a new file. We are going to be using here a version for it. Let's use the const keyword to define a version for the service worker that we are currently running. This version number, we are adding it for learning purposes. This is going to help us to understand better how the service worker lifecycle works. Let's make it a string and we are going to call it for the moment v1. In order to better understand how service workers work, we're going to be logging this version number in every logging statement that we make inside the service worker, so that we can clearly link a certain behavior that we observe to a certain version of the service worker. Right now, we simply want to log to the console that we are installing version 1 of this service worker. Because we will be using logging a lot to really understand how service workers work, we are going to create here a logging function that is going to take here an array of messages and is simply going to log them to the console, but in each logging statement we will be prepending the version. This is going to be very helpful to understand how service workers work. Right now let's start using this function. We are going to simply say log installing service worker. So let's try out this very simple script to see how this works. Before trying this out, notice these two files, service worker register and the service worker file, are being served by the Angular CLI. Notice here in our configuration file angularcli.json that we have added here to the assets property a couple of extra files. So we have here the registration for the service worker, we have the service worker itself, and we have here a couple of other files that we will be using in future lessons. This configuration will not be needed in a production Angular application. Everything will be available out of the box. This is just needed here in our sample application because we want to create our own custom service worker for learning purposes only. The effect that this configuration has is that it allows the Angular CLI to serve these files. If we don't have this configuration in place, then we would get an error from the Angular CLI development server if, for example, we try to load here the registration script. Once this is in place, we are ready to activate our first service worker. In order to better see what is going on, let's switch to a larger window. We are going to put in here in the URL bar our localhost application. This is going to load the application and take a look. We are using here the Chrome DevTools. We have selected here the application tab, service workers, and we can see here that there is a service worker up and running in this web application. If we click here on the source of the service worker, we are going to confirm that this is indeed the service worker script that we just wrote. Now let's have a look at the console. As we can see, we have the logging message installing service worker version 1 and we have here service worker registration completed. If by some reason you are not getting these exact console log statements, it might have been because you loaded this in another tab. If you want to see these console statements, you head over here to your application tab and you can simply unregister the service worker, click unregister and then simply reload the application. You are going to see the registration process again. Notice that if you reload the page, the service worker will not be installed again. The registration completed event is still being triggered, but we can see here that no logging statement occurred here inside the body of the service worker. So this logging statement was not executed. This means that when we refreshed this page, the service worker remained active. The same instance of the service worker will still be running across page refreshes. The browser will activate or deactivate the service worker at certain key events in order to spare resources, especially on mobile. Let's see a concrete example where the browser is going to deactivate this service worker. Now let's see what happens if we open another tab on the same page. Let's see if the registration process is also triggered. So here on the first tab we had here instance 954. If we switch over to the new tab, we also have here instance 954 activated and running. Now let's see one example of what could cause the deactivation of the service worker. To see that, we are going to open here another tab. We are going to open a blank tab. We're going to open the DevTools, and then here at the level of the Service Worker tab, we are going to make sure to click here the Show All checkbox. So with this checkbox, if we scroll down a little bit, we're going to see here the Service Worker for localhost. We are also going to see all the service workers of all the sites that you have visited recently that have service worker functionality enabled. Here we can see localhost, and we can see here instance 954 is still up and running. Let's then see when will this instance get deactivated. By the way, you can stop it here and you can also unregister if you want. Right now, let's focus on deactivation. Let's first close one tab. We're going to wait a little bit. We're going to see that the instance will still remain active and running. Now let's close the second tab and see what happens. So now all the localhost tabs have been stopped, and if we wait a moment, we are going to see that this instance is going to get stopped, and after a moment this instance will get deactivated. So now this service worker is stopped. As we can see in this example, at a given point the browser is going to stop the service worker to spare resources. This is especially important on mobile. Let's now see how this works in terms of service worker versions. Let's say that a new version of the service worker is available. How is this going to be handled by the browser?